Hi guys, my name is Basie and welcome to my 10-minute history channel where I try to give you a bunch of info about historical events in 10 minutes or less. Today we're going to be talking about a favorite subject of mine, namely the tank war on the Eastern Front viewed from the German point of view. On 22nd of June 1941, the German war machine and its allies invaded the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front would become the biggest meat grinder of World War II, with both major powers fighting it out over 4 years of grueling war. The Germans would make their offensive moves in the summer, while the Russians were counterattacking as soon as the ground froze during winter. In the vastness of the Soviet Union, one major asset of both armies' arsenal would prove decisive in penetrating the enemy lines and exploiting the gaps: their armored forces. The Germans had a strong armored fist at their offensive forefront. Almost 3,300 tanks and assault guns would smash through the Soviet positions massed in the famous Panzer groups. Almost two-thirds of the armor were made up of light tank models, namely Panzer I, Panzer II, and the captured Czechoslovakian Panzer 35 and Panzer 38. The rest was comprised of medium Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks supported by a couple of hundred assault guns. To note, the vast majority of the tanks had either short 75mm infantry guns or 20 or 37mm anti-tank guns. Meeting the Soviet armored forces was a shock for the Germans, who found themselves outgunned, out-armored and outnumbered. The losses were high among the Panzer Divisions, and only their training and radio communication made it that they prevailed due to their superior tactics. As operations were ongoing, reinforcements kept powering towards the front. This replenished the badly mauled Panzer forces. Critically, the force also received 1,500 up-armored and up-gunned Panzer IIIs. As operations started again in the summer of 1942, the Germans found themselves facing new Soviet tank battalions, now with a bit more skill on their side. Losses were even more grievous during the year, with the German juggernaut smashing against Stalingrad and then desperately trying to stop the Soviet counteroffensive in the winter. The majority of the Panzer forces were badly hit, with replacement tanks being pressed into action and knocked out as soon as they would arrive. By spring of 1943 though, the Germans were already pressing into service brand new models that they developed as soon as they met the fearsome Soviet armor. The light tank production was diminished, but the factories that were producing the chassis started to churn out the excellent Marder II and Marder III tank hunters. Armed with captured Russian 76.2mm guns, these were based on the Panzer II and Panzer 38 tanks. Additionally, up-armored and up-gunned Panzer III and Panzer IV models were being produced in massive numbers. The Panzer IV F2 especially was excellent at dealing with the heavier Russian tanks due to the 75mm anti-tank gun it sported. The Stug assault gun would also be upgunned, and 800 of the new F models were produced. Realizing the need for mobile heavy firepower, Hammer self-propelled artillery guns started to arrive on the front. Lastly, the might of the German engineering produced 3 brand new models, namely the Panther, the Tiger, and the Ferdinand. These tanks would prove to be more than a match for anything that the Soviets had available during the war, but as Operation Citadel started, they were a small part of the German division. Still, grouped in the powerful SS units, they would fight with a ferocity that would see Russian casualties pile up in enormous numbers. The German 1943 summer offensive would present a modernized armored force. Light tanks were basically non-existent, and the core of the force would be based around 2,400 medium tanks, including 500 new Panzer tanks. The Tigers were the new steel hammer, representing the heavy tank battalions that would spearhead the offensive. Supporting them would be 1,000 assault guns and 600 light tank destroyers. As 1943 summer passed, autumn and winter saw the usual Russian counteroffensive. Most of the German light tanks were basically obsolete already, and the majority were lost. However, a new scout light tank was produced, the Panzer II Lux, used only for reconnaissance missions. The upgunned Panzer IIIs were deemed unsuitable and production was soon stopped. The Panzer IV-F saw good success and production accelerated, with almost 3,000 Panzer IV-H being delivered during the year, with half of those being written off before the year's end. Production accelerated also for arguably the best tank of World War II, the Panther. A staggering 2,400 were produced, with 1,600 lost up to the spring of 1944. The Tiger battalions saw heavy casualties as they were now the first to go in and the last to go out in any major action. Still, plenty of new units were arriving as replacements, so the operational numbers grew. Assault guns became loved by the infantry so much and they proved to be so efficient that production was also ramped up to almost 13,500 new units, 280 of which were the new Stug 4. As for the tank destroyers, the Ferdinand saw 40 units lost in just 2 months of fighting, but they accounted for almost 500 Russian tanks destroyed, an amazing 12-to-1 kill ratio. The Marder II was being phased out, while the Marder III was kept in production. Self-propelled artillery was strengthened with both Hummels and the new Wasp and Grill models. Lastly, 1943's technological advancements were materialized in the new Nation tank destroyer, the new Jagdpanzer tank destroyer, and the monstrous new heavy tank, the King Tiger. These monsters could knock out Soviet tanks from more than 3 kilometers. The German armored forces of 1944 were, although much more modern, smaller than the 1943 Bush. It was now clear that there would be no summer offensive, and as Soviet power grew, the German tanks would be pressed into holding the Red Army's advance. To do that, the Germans were counting on 1,500 medium tanks, 300 heavy tanks, 1,500 assault guns, 350 self-propelled artillery, and 900 tank destroyers. The Allied invasion of Normandy would prove to be a decisive blow to the Eastern Front, as half of the tank production would be diverted towards units in the west. To that end, 1944 was a very rough year for an already diminished German tank force. Medium tank casualties were starting to surpass production, and the heavy tank battalions started to lose more tanks to technical breakdown than to enemy action. Although excellent in the new defensive war doctrine, the assault gun numbers also diminished, while self-propelled artillery all but vanished. Lastly, the tank destroyers would be decimated, as the Marder III were already starting to be obsolete and the Nation and Jagdpanther production was too small to compensate. However, the new Hetzer model was made available together with the new Jagdpanzer IV. Being based on the Panzer 38, the Hetzer was extremely cheap to produce and quite effective as a tank destroyer, as it had a minuscule profile. The Jagdpanzer IV was taller, however it did sport a better gun, it had better frontal armor and was again cheap to make as it was based on the Panzer IV chassis. More as a moral support, 20 Jagd Tigers were delivered, and although they were capable of handling targets for up to 4 kilometers, they were extremely hard to move around. It is now 1945 and the defense of the fatherland is in the hands of a much diminished and hard-pressed German armored corps. Only 250 medium and heavy tanks are available together with 600 assault guns. 1,000 tank destroyers form the bulk of the mobile anti-tank force, accompanied by almost 200 self-propelled artillery. One cannot help but notice that the majority of the Panzer Divisions are now equipped with turretless vehicles in a pure defensive posture. Production continued into 1945, and it's a miracle that even those numbers were produced, but it was now too late. Berlin had fallen and the German army on both fronts surrendered. Looking back, a total of 33,000 tanks were delivered to the Eastern Front, with an amazing 2/3 of them being Panzer IVs, Panthers and Stug 3s. Whenever someone asks you what the best German tanks were in World War II, be sure to refer them to this list. Alright guys, thank you for watching and I really hope you enjoyed this presentation. The research alone took me the better part of 20 something hours, and if it's something I learned is that there are at least 3 or 4 credible sources for both tank production and losses on the Eastern Front. Needless to say, these authors do not agree with each other and the numbers are sometimes wildly different. However, I think looking at the bigger picture is more important and I hope I achieved that with this video. Leave a like, subscribe and check back soon for the same analysis done for the Soviets.